and welcome to the first episode of A Bite Out of Crime, a true crime series focused on criminals that used food as their murder weapon. Our first case is a little odd, as there are some that consider the murderer to also be a victim. This would be Mary Mallon, also known as Typhoid Mary, a woman infamously known for spreading typhoid fever. Mary Mallon was born in 1869 in Cookstown, County Tyrone, Ireland. Not much is known about her life prior to when she emigrated to the United States at age 15, but she was presumably born with typhoid fever, because her mother was infected during pregnancy. Once she arrived in America, like many other Irish women during the time, Mary became a domestic servant. She was likely an exceptional cook, because she was repeatedly hired by wealthy families. Prior to the investigation led by George Soper that eventually led to her capture, Mary Mallon was employed by 8 affluent families from 1900 to 1907. And all but one experienced a typhoid breakout. However, it was not until the final family she worked for became infected when an official investigation began. Let's get into the investigation. In August 1906, Mallon traveled with Charles Warren, a wealthy New York banker, and his family to a house they rented in Oyster Bay. From that August to September, 6 of the 11 family members that traveled with Warren contracted typhoid fever, and his only daughter passed. This being Mallon's first confirmed death. The landlord of the house Warren rented became overly concerned that he wouldn't be able to rent the house again, because typhoid fever was a disease that people linked to poverty, slums, and unsanitary conditions. This is what led Warren's property owner, Walter Bowen, to hire George Soper, a freelance sanitary engineer who'd investigated typhoid fever outbreaks in the past. He first started with the typical sources such as plumbing and the food suppliers, but these tests all came back negative, leading to the staff and eventually Mary Mallon. When George Soper initially approached Mallon and asked for samples based on the suspicion that she was spreading the disease, she became incredibly irate, and even threatened him with a carving fork. However, after discovering where Mary Mallon lived, Soper approached her again, along with Dr. Raymond Hubler, hoping to convince her to give a sample voluntarily. Unfortunately, she refused, saying typhoid fever was everywhere, and the outbreaks were caused by food and water. Without her cooperation, Soper notified the New York City Health Department, who arrested her as a public health threat. She was then forced into an ambulance by 5 police officers and Dr. Josephine Baker, who at some point had to sit on Mallon to restrain her, according to an article published by Soper called The Curious Career of Typhoid Mary. When the interrogation began, Mary revealed that she rarely washed her hands. While this is incredibly unsanitary, it was common because the germ theory of disease, which encouraged hand washing as a preventative measure for disease, was not yet fully accepted. After the samples taken from Mallon confirmed she was the source of the typhoid outbreaks, on March 7, 1907, she was sentenced to quarantine on North Brother Island, which is one in a pair of small islands found in New York City's East River. During her time in quarantine, she underwent rigorous medical treatments and was tested multiple times throughout the day. This time was incredibly stressful for Mallon, which was exaggerated by the fact that she didn't really have any human interactions, only a dog. After 2 years and 11 months in February 1910, Mary Mallon was released under the assurance by signed affidavit that she would take hygienic precautions to ensure the safety of others, and would not work as a cook. Sadly, Mallon would violate the terms of her release and continue to spread the disease. Initially after her release, Mary worked as a launderer. But this job paid less than cooking, and she suffered an arm injury that prevented her from working for 6 months. After these inconveniences, she returned to cooking under false surnames, and this time worked in the mass sector instead of well-to-do families. These locations included restaurants, hotels, hospitals, and spa centers. She continued doing these types of jobs for 5 years, until she started working at Sloan Hospital for Women in 1915, which again led to a typhoid outbreak, this time infecting 25 people, and causing the deaths of 2 people. After these cases, a doctor at the hospital called George Soper and asked that he help with the investigation. Soper soon found that the source of the typhoid outbreak was again Mary Mallon, based on the descriptions given by her co-workers, and her handwriting. Despite her attempt to flee, She was found sometime later that year, on March 15, 1915, and was returned to quarantine on North Brother Island, where she remained for 23 years. Until she passed. Quarantine was more comfortable for Mallon this time, as she was given her own cottage on the island, and after 1918 she was allowed day trips to the mainland. Also, in 1925 Dr. Alexander Plavska came to the island for an internship, and allowed Mallon to work for her as a technician, allowing her to have more than a dog for companionship. During her time as a chef, Mary Mallon infected 53 people, and caused the deaths of 5 people. However, these are only the confirmed cases, and there were likely many more. There are many legal and ethical factors to consider regarding this case, that make it harder to decide whether Mallon deserved the treatment she received, or if she was treated unfairly considering she did have an illness. For instance, many medical experts at the time disagreed with Mallon being forcibly quarantined, and argued that instead, she should be taught to carefully treat her condition and ensure that she would not transmit typhoid to others. This is especially true if she was unaware she had typhoid fever, which is possible considering she never appeared sick to anyone, and at the time there were no known asymptomatic carriers. Also, her first time in quarantine was in no way easy, and in a letter she wrote to her lawyer, she said that at one point her eye had become paralyzed, and she wasn't allowed to visit an eye doctor to treat it. This is partially what led her to try and sue the New York Health Department, further stating that she was treated like a, quote, guinea pig. Ultimately, this attempt was unsuccessful. However, others argue that her actions and carelessness killed people, and if she knew that she was a carrier for typhoid, then what she did could be considered murder, or at least manslaughter. Historian B.D. Maclay, and many others, believe that her defensiveness when asked about typhoid was a sign that she was aware she may be carrying the bacteria. For instance, when private investigator, George Soper, would try to ask Mary about typhoid, she would literally run away, even in her own home. Additionally, after she was released from quarantine and worked under false surnames, each time there was a typhoid outbreak, she would flee without giving a forwarding address, which could be a sign of her guilt, or that she was scared of being found. Mallon having knowledge of carrying typhoid fever could never be proven, because at least throughout the entirety of her first stint in quarantine, she never believed that she had typhoid fever. And, there is no record of her verbally accepting she had typhoid later on in life. While there are a slew of arguments that could be made about this case, one positive outcome was that Mary's case allowed other asymptomatic carriers to be found and their cases were handled much more responsibly. For example, because doctors never treated someone in her condition, Mallon's medical treatments were hectic, and at times even damaging to her health. Also, Mallon was vilified in newspapers and even given the nickname Typhoid Mary. Nevertheless, cases after Mallon's were handled much more discreetly, and doctors had a protocol to follow, allowing them to keep the public and the next asymptomatic carrier safe. Thanks for watching the first episode of A Bite Out of Crime. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode. Do you believe Mary Mallon was aware she had typhoid fever? Or was she treated unfairly considering the circumstances? Leave a comment down below.